When I first tried to make a gluten-free sourdough bread, I ended up with a total mess. And that was probably 12 years ago or more. And it didn't turn out at all. It didn't rise. It was hardly even edible. Actually, I think I might have given it to the chickens. So the last few years I've been working on the gluten-free sourdough a little more, perfecting it. At this point, there are a lot more recipes out there than when I started. So it was a little bit easier, but a lot of the recipes take the more expensive pre-mixed flour blends, and I just didn't want to go that route. I was looking for something to save money mostly, because the gluten-free bread that I was buying had just gone up to $8 a loaf, and my other recipe for a yeast bread costs about that much to make, because it's based in almond flour, which is really good and really good for you. But I really wanted something that I could make every week, even multiple times a week, that didn't cost an arm and a leg. So that's mostly what I was going for here, and since then I've adapted the recipe to be a lot easier. You know, I'm a busy mom and homesteader, and I didn't have a lot of time. A lot of the instructions that you find online for gluten-free bread are just complicated. And you've got all of your discarding, and it seems like there's so much maintenance for your sourdough starter. So today I'm going to show you the system that I have worked my way into, really. And so this is probably the simplest system for a gluten-free sourdough that you can find, or maybe for any sourdough. And it also is really inexpensive. So the way I'm doing this, it costs me about $1.75 per loaf if I don't put honey in it. If I do add honey, then that brings it up to maybe $2.05 for a loaf of bread at this time. So the ingredients that I'm using today, I have my sourdough starter. I started off with a starter from Cultures of Health. You can go on the Cultures of Health website to order it, or you can get it straight from Azure, which is also where I get all of my bulk flours and the other ingredients for this. So I highly recommend Azure if you haven't heard of it. It's a natural foods co-op, and it delivers for free to most of the United States. There's no membership fees. You sign up and then you can place an order whenever you want. Most areas they deliver once a month, and it is really a great way to save money. So I buy my rice flour here in 25-pound bags, and then the other flour that I use in this is the tapioca flour, which they have I think a 5, a 25, and a 55-pound bag of that. So I get the 55-pound bag since we go through it fairly fast, and that saves me the most money. So I will put a link to that in the description for this video. But you can also get this Cultures for Health starter straight from the Cultures of Health website. Or if you have a friend that has a gluten-free starter, you can ask for just a half a cup of their starter. And then you save all of the time of getting a box starter going. If you're starting with a box starter, then it is going to be more work for the first week or two. You'll want to follow the directions on the box starter, like the one for Cultures of Health. And then you'll probably want to use your sourdough in different recipes other than bread for at least the first few weeks, because it does take a while to activate a new starter and get it going if you're starting with the boxed sourdough starter. So once you have it going, what I do on this is I feed it half a cup of brown rice flour and 1/3 of a cup of water and stir it in, and I do that once a day. If you are not going to be making bread for a few days, you can feed it and stick it in the refrigerator for up to 1 week with no further attention. So that's really handy. You know, if I've just made bread and I'm thinking, well, I'm not going to make bread for another week here, then I'll feed it, stick it in the refrigerator for maybe 3 or 4 days, and then I'll bring it out a few days before I'm ready to make sourdough and start feeding it again. So for this recipe, it takes 4 cups of tapioca starch, and then I'm going to go grab 4 cups of rice flour here. I am using brown rice flour. When I first started, I was mixing brown rice flour and white rice flour, and I found there wasn't really any difference in taste. So I would rather have the brown rice flour that has a little more nutrition, and then I only have to buy 2 different flours instead of 3, so that just simplifies it. So I'm going to go grab that and I will be right back. Okay, I am back with my brown rice flour here, 4 cups. I'm going to add this to my bowl. Then I'm going to add some guar gum. When you are making a gluten-free bread, you really want to add either guar gum or xanthan gum as a binder. I have tried this without and it doesn't rise because there's nothing to stretch. It just bakes into a dense brick. So really not a very pleasant bread without this. You could also try psyllium husk. I have not tried it, but if you do try it in this recipe, let me know in the comments whether it works. So I'm going to add 3 tablespoons of guar gum. And this is something else that I buy from Azure. They have, I think it's a 5-pack of these little bags. So you can save a lot of money that way versus buying it in the grocery store. And then I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of salt. You can do whatever kind of salt you like. I like Himalayan pink salt. So that is what I am using in mine. And then optionally, you can add 1/4 cup of sugar or honey. I'm going to mix this up a little bit first. I don't always add a sweetener to this. It really doesn't need it, but it will have more of a sour flavor without. My husband likes it either way. I think I like it a little better when it has some kind of sweetener. So this recipe makes 2 large loaves. And buying the ingredients in bulk, it costs $1.75 at the time of making this video. $1.75 per loaf without the honey. If I add the honey, that brings it up to $2.05 per loaf, I believe. All right, I'm going to go get 3 cups of water to add to this. All right, so I have 3 cups of water. And now I just need my sourdough starter. So I'm going to add roughly 2.5 cups of sourdough starter to this. You want your sourdough starter to be fed the day that you're adding it, but not right before you add it because you don't want just flour and water in here that's not cultured. So it's been about 4 hours since I fed this starter. You want probably 4 to 8 hours is a good range between feeding the starter and using it in bread. And I want to make sure that I save back at least 1/2 cup of this to get my new starter going. Some of the flour stayed on the bottom of that, but that is okay. Sometimes the starter will separate a little bit as it sits. The flour will settle more toward the bottom, and the top will be more liquid. So I'm going to get this all mixed up, and then I'll show you what I do with the starter. Now at this point, you want this dough to be really thick as you possibly can, but still having the flour incorporated, because it'll get more runny as it sits. I have heard that you're not supposed to do sourdough in a metal container or metal bowl, or even some people won't use a metal spoon. I honestly haven't noticed any difference. Typically I use my glass bowl and then whatever spoon I have handy. I still have some flour over on the side that's not incorporated here, so I'm just trying to work it in. And you can certainly use a mixer for this if you have one. I do have a mixer, but I would rather not dirty another dish, so I find it's easier to just mix it up in this bowl that has a lid. And then I can just put the lid on and leave it to sit, and it's really easy. So this is a pretty stiff dough. If you're not getting the right consistency, you can add a little more flour or a little more water. Sometimes different batches of flour will be finer than others, or if you're substituting different ingredients for the ones I use, then you might need more or less water. But this recipe honestly is not that sensitive. It is pretty foolproof the way I'm doing it. Alright, so I got that pretty well mixed. I am going to put a lid on this and I will let it sit overnight. Anywhere between 12 and 24 hours is a good amount of time to let this sit. And at the end of that time, it should be a little more runny and it'll bubble up and rise. And then it'll be ready to bake. So for my sourdough starter, I switch out the jar that it's in probably once a week-ish. Whenever the jar starts getting yucky, you can switch it out to a new one. You don't need to switch it every time that you feed it. So I'm just going to add half a cup of brown rice flour, and then I'm going to go get 1/3 of a cup of water. Alright, I have 1/3 of a cup of water. I'm going to put this in, give it a quick stir. And then for something that's fermented, to avoid an explosion, it's a good idea to use a lid that's breathable. So I use these coffee filters just with a canning ring on top. You could also use a cloth or a paper towel. It would probably work to just use a regular canning lid and put it on loosely. Don't tighten it down at all. And then I'm going to put this in the fridge because I'm not going to want to make bread for probably another week. So maybe 3 or 4 days from now, I'll get it out again and start feeding it until I build up enough for my recipe. So if you want to make bread faster, you can build this up faster. Since I don't want to make bread every single day, I find that it works really well to just do the half a cup of flour to 1/3 cup of water and add that every day until it builds up to about 3/4 of a jar, which is what I want for my 2 large loaves of bread. So I am going to let this dough sit for 12 to 24 hours, and then I will come back and show you how I bake it. Well, it has been 20 hours since I mixed this up, and you can see that it's a lot softer than it was to start with. The dough was super thick to start with, and now it's a little more runny, but it's got a nice rise on it. There's lots of bubbles in there. So that looks perfect. I usually give it anywhere between 12 and 24 hours to rise at room temperature after I mix it up. If you go with the 12-hour time, your bread usually won't rise as much, but it'll have a milder flavor. Going with 24 hours, you're going to have a lot more of a sour flavor, but you'll also get a nice rise on it. Some people do refrigerate it for the last half, so maybe keep it at room temperature for 8 to 10 hours, and then put it in the refrigerator for another 12. I have done that, and I didn't notice a huge difference, but it will cut the sourness a little bit. So today I'm going to be making a loaf and then also a round in cast iron. When I first started with making gluten-free sourdough, I tried putting it in a cast iron Dutch oven that had a lid. So you would put the bread on top of parchment paper in your preheated cast iron Dutch oven. You'd stick ice cubes underneath the parchment, and then you'd put a lid on the top. And I found that with the gluten-free, that just made a really hard, chewy crust, and I didn't really care for it. So I am cooking these without a lid, and then I actually am going to add a different cast iron pan. This is going to go on the bottom rack of my oven. This is just a cast iron baking sheet that has about 1/2 inch of water on it. So that's going to do 2 things. First, that extra layer of cast iron on the bottom is going to keep the bottom of my bread from getting too tough and crusty. And then second, we have the water in there that's going to give it a steam bath. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in the oven. The oven is preheated to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And then I'll mix up this bread. Alright, so I have my cast iron sheet pan on the bottom of the oven, so it's starting to get nice and steamy in there. I'm going to add just a little bit of rice flour on the bottom of my pans to help my bread not stick. And this also gives a really nice texture to the bread, I found. Kind of like pizza crust where you put cornmeal underneath. This is kind of the same idea. So I'm just going to divide this up more or less evenly. The loaf pan will take longer to cook. So I will probably check on the round in about 50 minutes. Honestly, I usually don't time it. I just keep checking on it until it looks right. But roughly 50 minutes, I'll check on the round and see if it looks cooked. The loaf pan, I'm going to give a little more time. You can also do baguettes with these. I do have a baguette pan, so I do that once in a while to mix it up. I think my favorite is just to do the round in the cast iron, like what I have here. But if you're not going to be eating it the same day, it's nice to have it in a loaf form so that you can easily slice it and toast it. So probably we'll eat this first one today, and then the loaf we'll save for breakfast tomorrow. So I'm going to dust a little bit more rice flour over the top of these so I can just smooth them out without my hands sticking. This doesn't need to be perfect. Just kind of smooth it out a little bit. If you are baking these without a pan that has sides, then you might want to add a little more flour at the end to make your dough stiffer. Because as you can see, this kind of spread out into my pan. And now I'm going to add some slices across the top of these. And this will just help them to rise nicer, but it also looks pretty. You can do whatever kind of fancy designs you want, or just cut an X. Oops. There's just a simple X. I like to make it a little bit fancier just for fun. So there. And these are ready to go in the oven. Well, these are done. The round I cooked for 55 minutes at 400 degrees. And I don't take the temperature of these. I just wait until it's kind of hard and crispy on the top, but still springy. The round is a little easier to get cooked in the middle than the loaf. So the loaf I cooked for an additional 25 minutes. So it was an hour and 20 minutes total. And then I actually take the temperature on this. I stick a thermometer in there and I cook it until it's at least 180 degrees internally. Otherwise, you can slice into it and realize that it is still dough on the inside, even though it might look done on the outside. So this loaf I'm going to be slicing up to eat tomorrow. So I'm going to wait until it cools to slice it. The round we're going to eat today, so it could be sliced into any time. You can pull these straight out of the oven and eat them hot. And they taste amazing straight out of the oven. So one final tip that I want to share for sourdough is to always keep a backup of your starter in the freezer. Sourdough starter can last for up to 6 months in the freezer. So I always keep a half a cup in a plastic container. Plastic because glass can burst and you lose your starter. So a plastic container in the freezer. And then if something goes wrong with your starter, you have a backup and you don't have to start all over buying a new sourdough starter and then getting it going and waiting for it to get active to make bread. So I actually had to use mine a few weeks ago. I had forgotten to feed my sourdough starter one day. The next day I checked it and it looked fine, so I went ahead and fed it. But then the third day I checked it and it was moldy. So since I had a backup in the freezer, I was able to just throw that out and start all over with my new starter.
Do you enjoy the challenge of gardening? So do I. That's why I began saving seeds from my garden more than 10 years ago. Saving seeds was a lot of fun, but I quickly discovered how much I didn't know, like how my pumpkins turned into pumpkininis and sweet peppers turned hot. Since I first started, I learned from other seed savers, read just about every seed-saving book out there, and each year put it all into practice in my own garden. I've combined everything I've learned into an easy online course that simplifies seed saving for beginners. With Simple Seed Saving, you can begin successfully saving seeds from your garden today. Simple Seed Saving gives you all the info you need to prevent unwanted crossing, save pure seeds from all of your plants to grow next year. The course includes handy reference charts, printable seed packets, and access to a private Facebook group where you can ask questions anytime. Saving seeds is a great way to save money, preserve your favorite seed varieties, and become less dependent on the grocery store. Start saving seeds today.